Thank you. Mr. Wittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us. Senator Warner, Chairman Hunter, Chairman Skelton, thank you so much for your service. You really have shown the way for us here on the House Armed Services Committee. And I wanted to begin by talking in a broad perspective about risk. And you all have been through a number of efforts to look at our defense posture, to look at defense reviews, whether it's a national defense strategy, quadrennial defense reviews. So you've seen how the threats have changed through the years. You've seen how the breadth and scope of our military has changed, where the challenges are. And if you look today, obviously we're in an extraordinarily challenging world with many different chapters that have been written, but many to be written, about what we do and how do we respond. And there are a lot of things we can do to look at the force structure and determine how do we change that. But as you've heard, the concern is that strategy should drive budgets. Budgets shouldn't drive strategies. Regardless of what goes on, those threats are there, they're real, and this country has to make sure that we are properly prepared for that. And the realm that we exist in is, what are the risks? What are the risks in the what-if scenarios? And I really am focused on what happens with our Marine Corps and our Navy. We talk about ships, we talked about the industrial base, and we've had recently some great successes there with USS Nimitz in that class, have been very successful. The USS Arleigh Burke, very successful class. The USS Virginia, Senator Warner, your brainchild there to make sure that was put forward, a very, very successful program. We talk about having those assets in addition to, as you all spoke so eloquently about, the men and women in our military, the best absolutely in the world, and doing a fantastic job. The question is this: if you could give us your estimate based on some of the proposed budget scenarios that have been put out there about reductions, both the $450 billion existing and then the sequestration that could result in an additional $500 billion, what do you believe are the risks that this nation faces in the future, and specifically with a Navy that may have less than 250 ships, with a Marine Corps that may lose a number of units? What is your estimate about the risk that we face and what this nation would be looking at? Our challenge is to communicate not just to members of this body, but to the public about what does this mean for this country and what are those risks. So you all have been through this process, know it intimately. I'd like to get your perspective on the risks that this nation faces with these budget scenarios.
Well, we start with the fundamental proposition, which is eminently clear to all of us. We're an island nation. Yes, this is a global community, a global economy, a global defense. But the fact is that we are dependent on the sea lanes of the world, which we call the common property of the world, observing sovereignty rights and others. But operating those sea lanes and protecting those sea lanes such that we can have our trade and the necessity of bringing in the raw materials and, regrettably, an abundance of fuel that we must have to support our economy. That is the prime mission of the United States Navy, and we've had it that way for years. Now, people argue about fewer and fewer ships. I remember 600-ship Navy, 300-ship Navy. Actually, when I was privileged to serve in the Navy Secretary, we had close to 900 ships. Most of them, regrettably, were old World War II ships, which we had to scrap. But the point is, don't let the numbers tangle you up. It's the capacity and the ability of the ship. The ship today is far greater in its capacity and ability in its weapon systems than the destroyers of the early era. And the same with the carriers. So they're magnificent ships. We simply must keep a replacement cycle, a modernization cycle going, but the numbers are not the magic. The key is come back to the island nation and our reliance on those sea lanes that must be kept open.
Mr. Wittman, China is developing
the ability, and I think at this point their game plan with respect to taking on the U.S. Navy is not to try to build a counterpart to the carriers and the attending ships, but to have the ability to kill them at long range with ballistic missiles, which are launched from the mainland, which have a high capability anti-ship targeting system. And they are developing those systems right now, and we're very concerned about those. That was offsetting that capability, that move, which we see right now and we're analyzing, will require a lot of money. If we have these draconian cuts that are proposed, we are going to lose the ability to protect our carrier battle groups in those areas of the far Pacific. We will lose it, and I would predict that it will be gone by 2020. We will not be the dominant force. In fact, we will be a subservient force in the Western Pacific. It will take an enormous investment, and there's several things you have to do, incidentally, with missile defense. You not only have to have the ability to shoot down those first several anti-ship missiles that come in, you have to be able to shoot down salvos of anti-ship missiles that come in. That means you need to have endurance built into your anti-missile programs. That requires money. It requires investment, requires innovation. The Navy will not be able to meet that challenge with the massive cuts that we have posited. So we lose the Western Pacific, and I think this clearly puts us on a glide slope to lose the Western Pacific. We lose the space battle. We lose the competition in space, which is key to our military operations. All the countries in the world watched with interest as they saw American precision munitions devastate Saddam Hussein's armored formations far ahead of our advancing 3rd Marines on the or 1st Marine Division on the right and 3rd Army Division on the left as we advanced up the Euphrates and the Tigris River plains in Iraq. They saw that. They saw that use of precision. If you knock out the satellites, those highly targeted precision munitions become dumb bombs and become much less effective. They understand that, and they have a military doctrine of going after a superior force by targeting a weakness and hitting it. So I think the space competition is part and parcel of maintaining a viable Navy. Now, with respect to the Marines and the Army, we are looking at scenarios that might occur at some point, and especially if China becomes expeditionary. That means it's able to move its forces to Africa or other places or other parts of the world where they want to protect an extractive industry, and they end up planting a military flag, and there's a confrontation. Putting explosives on target with electronics today has changed the face of warfare. As I said, precision munitions used for the first time in the majority in Iraq were devastating to the enemy. If we allow China to have that ability to knock out our precision capability, that is, if we lose the space contest, those Marines and soldiers who have to, in the end, carry the battle to the enemy. And we learned in Iraq that this isn't a push-button world. As Kip Yeager fought his last battle and finished it with a knife, the grandson of the great Chuck Yeager, who broke the speed of sound, in a small room in Fallujah, we learned that it's not a push-button world. It's a world that ends up with young men fighting at close range, and they're Marines and they're soldiers. And the investment that we've made in blunting the capability of the other side to kill those young men becomes very critical. So the exposure to land forces that would work in any of a number of scenarios in the Western Pacific will be massive, and we will take massive casualties. A second way we would take casualties is this. We have very few bombers today. We're at a historic low point with respect to bomber aircraft, long-range bomber aircraft. They are very important in armor battles. Now, we didn't have big armor battles in Iraq and Afghanistan. But if you have armor battles and you need to utilize bomber strikes to neutralize the armor capability of the other side. All of our analyses that we've taken now say even with the number of bombers that we have today, if we have two scenarios that involve armor, we're going to have to swing the bombers. The Air Force calls this swinging the bombers. Swinging the bombers means that you take them out of one theater where you're fighting, which is risky, and you expose that theater, and you take them over to the other theater and let them make a strike. And when you ask the question, what does the risk translate into? In the end, the briefer will tell you increased casualties. Because if you don't have those bomber aircraft there to blunt that armored attack, you'll take American casualties. So as our investment in protecting our ground fighting elements goes down, protecting them by continuing to advance the technology that protects them, like having precision missile guidance that allows you to knock out armored formations far ahead of your infantry. If we cease to keep up with other nations that are trying to neutralize that ability so they can get in and kill our soldiers and Marines, then you will have a massive increase in the risk of death and high casualty numbers in those ranks. So that's a second major risk. Lastly, airlift, sea lift. You can't undertake the airlift and sea lift that we need in these expeditionary roles that we've been in with these massive cuts. You simply can't do it. We're down to a fairly historic low with respect to our airlift. You got roughly, we've got a little more than half of the airfields available to us around the world that we had in the 1960s. So having long-range lift and intra-theater lift, very important. Our lift assets will go down measurably under these massive budget cuts. That means we won't be able to move men and materiel into locations in a timely manner, and that means that you lose contests, and you lose people, and you lose ground. So those are several of the risks that are inherent in these proposed cuts.
Your question is that of risks. Of course, we are aware fully of the trend of China, fully aware of what is happening in the Arab world, but we really don't know where the next shoe will drop. I strongly suggest keeping a very strong intelligence network, including paying more attention to the human element thereof, which was devastated a good number of years ago and now slowly being built up. In addition to that, you will need to have and to educate and to protect strategic thinkers within our military who will be listened to by members of Congress and by the administration. I once asked General Robert Scales, who's a former president of the Army War College and a great historian. I asked him, out of an average graduating class from the Army War College, how many could immediately have a serious conversation with George C. Marshall? And he said 2 or 3. But that's all right. These would be strategic thinkers that others have relied on. Harry Truman had them around him. Dwight Eisenhower had them around him. And you have to identify them and protect them in the career. I cannot emphasize that enough, because when some of them are identified and not shepherded into solid positions and kept in the military, you're losing a national asset. These are the ones who can say, look out for, and 9 times out of 10, they're right. That is the best I think you can do, intelligence and strategic thinkers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.